So today I'm going to be drawing on some of the themes that I have put into the briefing paper that Tim and I published at the end of last month. Just out of curiosity, how many people here have read that briefing paper? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so I'm going to be picking up some of the themes that were in that. I'm not going to be just regurgitating what was in that though. I'm going to be actually trying to focus a bit on some of the findings, as Tim said, from my research, which I've been doing over the last couple of years. So I'm going to set the scene for advocacy and food, look a little bit at the theory. There is a handout, I don't know if any of you picked it up, but there is a handout which just is taken out of the briefing paper but looks at some of the theories, because I'm going to go over it very quickly so that I can focus on some of the other areas. I'm going to be looking at types of advocacy and some examples from my interviews of areas of kind of critique, if you like, of advocacy, and then I'm going to raise some questions around the effectiveness of advocacy, and then we're going to have a bit of a discussion. And just before I start, I just wanted to throw some questions out that we'll discuss later, but just for you to bear in mind as I'm talking to, channel your thoughts. So really, I think it would be great if we could have a discussion afterwards about examples of advocacy from your own area of work, factors that you think lead to success or experience that you've had with successful advocacy. Think about maybe what we need to do better in food, what's working, what's not, sort of where are we, and what does civil society want or need from academia, and vice versa, what does academia need from civil society moving forward on the sort of advocacy and food issue. So if we start with looking at what is advocacy. Now, advocacy means very slightly different things to different people depending where you work, what your background is. But essentially it's action to communicate a viewpoint in order to get change. And this is usually policy change, but it's not always policy change. Sometimes it can be behaviour change, sometimes it can be someone's perception of something. It can be a wide range of things, not just policy, but it usually is around policy, particularly when people say, I'm advocating. It encompasses a wide range of tools, tactics and techniques. So there's a whole spectrum, which I'll talk about a bit in a minute, around what you can actually do if you're advocating. It seeks to influence, shape and hold to account the policies, actions and decisions of the institutional elite. And the phrase institutional elite is quite important here, I think, because perhaps previously it had really been focused around governments, but with changing in politics and how politics works, actually focusing directly on, for instance, the industry is an increasingly useful way of targeting advocacy rather than going sort of directly to the government. So I think looking at the institutional elite is a better way of looking at advocacy. It's about raising awareness of issues, setting agendas, but also making sure that those agendas stay a priority and that action is actually taken on those agendas. Public health advocacy specifically seeks to protect or serve the public interest, which again, as I'll talk about in a second, is increasingly important in times when there's actually a market interest-driven government. It's important in a democratic society to give minority groups a voice. And here I think it's important to note that a minority group could be a small community, it could be a particular group that has a certain health condition. But actually, if we're looking at the market power that we see in sort of governance today, actually the minority group could just be seen as the general population. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're only looking at small groups of people, we're looking at the whole population. It provides a counterbalance to market interests and to the status quo and the current way of doing things. And a wide range of people can advocate. It can be individuals, it can be NGOs, it can be governments. Internally in governments, they might advocate to different departments. Industry might advocate to each other. But my research is specifically looking at NGOs, so that's the kind of perspective that a lot of my work is coming from, although I recognise there are kind of other areas. And from my interviews, I asked people, the first question I asked was, what is advocacy? What do you see as advocacy? It's a good icebreaker, if nothing else. And just some of the quotes that came out of that that kind of reflect the different elements of advocacy, if you like. So one, it's really more about doing uncomfortable things to achieve something, stuff that most people don't want to or aren't prepared to do. So this is looking at advocates as kind of going out of the normal friendly conversation, if you like, and actually challenging what's being done and challenging groups of people on their actions. At the heart of it is fact-based decision to change the status quo. So I think the fact that it's fact-based is important here. This is looking at the evidence side of advocacy, and also the, as I mentioned before, changing the status quo, changing the systems that we are living in. I think it's also about relationship building and understanding other points of view. So again, I've highlighted relationship building. I'm going to pick up on this a bit later in the presentation, but I think it's important that relationships are kind of a key part of advocacy, whether that's relationships between civil society groups or relationships between civil society and what could be referred to as their opposition. And then finally, well, I see it as attempting to progress a goal or an objective which improves the population's health or mobilises resources and action and public concern about a public health matter or an aspect of population health. And again, I've highlighted public concern because I think the public is a really important part of advocacy. At the end of the day, as I said, we're supposed to be representing the public, and this is again an issue that I'm going to pick up again later on. So why do we need advocacy? Everybody here knows why we need advocacy in food and health. We have a lot of problems today. We have high obesity rates. We have a lot of preventable chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases. We still have nutrient deficiencies. As Tim's been speaking about recently, food banks are an increasing problem, in particular this kind of idea that we need to increase food banks. So that's another area. We're one of the most developed countries in the world, and yet we have groups of people who can't afford food. It's just a bit wrong, really. We have climate change, environmental and sustainability concerns around the food that we're eating, animal welfare concerns, inequalities. There's a lot of evidence that indicates that poor diets, that obesity are linked to inequalities. So this is a kind of key factor that needs to be addressed. We have issues around farmer rights, and this was seen recently with the campaigning by the farmers who produce milk, and the issues around the pay that they were getting. And then we also have factors linked to trade negotiations, so CAP reform, TTIP, which impact on food, which impact on public health. So there's a wide range of areas, and different people will focus on different elements of this. And again, as advocates, we're in a very complex political world. We're faced with globalisation, so multinational organisations, global and regional policies, and trade agreements. So this means that if we're looking at advocacy in the UK, it's not just a case of simply targeting UK actors and UK policies. Actually, we need to be looking further afield, and policy decisions made elsewhere are impacting on what's happening here. So this makes advocacy a bit more challenging and complex. Neoliberalism means that there's an emphasis on deregulation, on market freedoms, and an emphasis often on behaviour change and personal responsibility as the solution to the policies that we're discussing. So again, this is a problem. If you're advocating for a policy change, for instance, and yet governments don't want to regulate, then this is a challenge in itself that you have to get over before you're even discussing the details of what a policy may or may not look like. Multi-stakeholder governance, again, linked to neoliberalism, you've got self-regulation, you've got voluntary agreements, you've got different actors competing for power, and increasingly the policy terrain is dominated by market interests, which means that advocates are very often on the back foot. And this is shown through neo-pluralism, which is around the power and where it lies, and the fact that market actors are able to access and use resources better in order to basically get what they want. And because advocacy is linked to policy change, it's therefore very much embedded in political sciences. Advocacy is not a thing in its own right. It doesn't just exist. It is a product of the issue and the policy context in which you're looking to work in. And I think it's really important that that's recognised. So whether it's a political will on the issue, whether it's solution desirability, whether it's the opposition, either way, you have to look at the full picture, and you can't just kind of isolate advocacy and say, we're going to do this. But it's also important to recognise there's no silver bullet and there's no one size fits all. And through my presentation and through my research, it's been quite challenging to negotiate that concept, that in trying to identify what's really effective in advocacy and what we should do in advocacy, but also saying, you know, there's no silver bullet is kind of a bit of a challenge to negotiate. In terms of policy change, there are 5 kind of key areas of policy change. You've got the agenda setting, you've got policy formulation, you've got decision making, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. Now, I personally think that this is quite accurate in that they are the areas that you need to consider in policy change. I think what's inaccurate is the fact that it's presented here as linear. There's a lot of different factors that contribute to policy change, and one of those is advocacy. Now, one of the problems with a lot of the political theories that look at policy change is that they don't really give a lot of emphasis to the advocacy itself. They're not looking at, okay, so this policy change happened, and they're looking at the reasons for that, but they're not really looking at, okay, well, what did the advocates do in order to help that, and how did that? So it might just be, oh, there was some advocacy or there was a group, but not actually looking at what was that group doing and how did they sort of strategically approach that, who were they tackling, and when did the changes kind of occur. So this is why we need to look at political theory, and also why a linear model of change is not necessarily logical. Political theories, you might have the tables in front of you, which goes into a bit more detail. So through some of my upgrade process for my PhD and also for the briefing paper, I kind of did very crude summary of the political theories, but looked at, okay, so if this is how policy changes, what advocacy can do, and what are the kind of focuses, if you like, of advocacy for each of them. So I'll just quickly go through these political theories, but we can come back to it later if people want to discuss it more. So one theory is the idea that there are windows of opportunity that arise when policies, problems, and politics, which are usually kind of running parallel to each other, align, and this can lead to change. Now here, advocates have a role in kind of arming themselves with the solutions, with the issues, in order to act when these factors might align. So it might be that a problem becomes increasingly pertinent. It might be that the political issues change, but it's about arming yourself in order to help get the change that you want. And this is similar in punctuated equilibrium theory, crisis theories, tipping point theories, which are all about abrupt changes that occur as a result, potentially of a crisis like the horse meat scandal, but also things like a new government, a new stakeholder. And again, advocates here have a role in kind of getting all the arguments together, getting the evidence together, getting the key messages together. And then when the opportunity arises, when that door kind of opens slightly where you can get in rather than waiting for that moment to occur. Advocacy coalition framework, social movements, they're more around the coordinated activity between different groups, looking at how they can exploit events, looking at research, challenging the status quo, challenging the dominant groups in order to stimulate change. And then narrative theory is around the communication, framing, and decision making that occurs, and how that can influence policy. I'm going to talk a bit more about messaging in a minute. Now, one of the other issues that Tim and I discussed in our briefing paper was the fact that there is a spectrum of advocacy. Advocacy isn't just one thing or another. It's not all inside, as I've called it, and it's not all outside. And it's different organisations have different roles on this spectrum. But it can be quite nicely kind of separated into 2 areas. So if you have your inside track advocacy, this is really about winning changes through the formal channels. So this is speaking to MPs, this is speaking to ministers, this is speaking to the people who are actually making decisions. It can be speaking to people in business as well. and negotiating and understanding and discussing what the policy is, what the outcomes are going to be, what the decisions are that are going to be made. Now, these are often in the context of short-term changes and very specific policies. So it might be that a government is discussing, for instance, marketing and are inviting people in to speak to them, or it might be that they've published a consultation and you want to try and influence that. But it will be on a very specific niche area that you'll have that access to speak to ministers. Very rarely will you be able to talk about big systems changes with a minister or civil servant, because it doesn't have that kind of buy in what they're doing. Generally speaking, with this kind of more inside formal advocacy, media is less important because you're not really particularly worried about or concerned about raising awareness amongst people on the outside, and often this kind of advocacy is done behind closed doors, so a lot of people aren't even aware that it's happening. And the main methods used are things like consultations and roundtables, advisory boards, meetings, collaborative research. These kind of formal advocacy, but it still is advocacy because it's an opportunity to influence change, to influence the policies and influence agendas. At the other end of the spectrum, you have outside track advocacy, which is much more out of the system, and it's often more adversarial, a lot more confrontational, and it's looking at getting the public support and the wider support for the issues being discussed. It's showing that there is a group of people, a large group of people, who are supportive of that idea and that want to see something different happen. Generally, but not always, it's more long-term. It's perhaps around a systems change, around how things are done, how we look at things, rather than on a specific policy. And media is a really important aspect of it in terms of amplifying the issue, amplifying the support, and getting other groups on side, getting the public on side, whatever it might be. Media can be really key. And generally speaking, the main methods are more around campaigning, petitions, lobbying, stunts, awareness, watchdog surveys, all of these kind of activities which are occurring and more challenging to the kind of status quo and the system. And throughout this, there's a lot of shared methods around coalitions, evidence and research, experts, getting allies, and using that in your advocacy. But as I said, this is kind of a spectrum. These are the kind of two ends of the spectrum, and some organisations will be kind of in the middle. So again, from my research, two quotes that sort of link this inside-outside advocacy. Sometimes you can have somebody in your organisation inside talking to civil servants, being nice and reasonable, finding out what the inside gossip is on this, that and the other. And at the same time, you can have the same organisation on the outside doing all that other stuff. Often that's tricky, and you sometimes need different organisations, one on the inside and another on the outside, or several on the inside and several on the outside, so you can have your cake and eat it. So this picks up quite nicely on this idea that some organisations work inside and outside, but also that different organisations work together to kind of get the full spectrum and to share experience in order to kind of push at different points. And then similarly, I think that NGOs of different stripes have very different relationships with government, and some will see their role as being very much more inside the tent to understand what the civil servants are trying to achieve and trying to support and arm the civil servants with what they need in order to get the policies agreed. Others prefer to do more on the outside, throwing the rocks in, and I think there is a need for all of those approaches in order for NGO sector to work effectively. They couldn't just be one or the other. So this is another interesting quote, and it's showing a role of advocacy and of NGOs in actually being of value to governments, as well as just kind of being separate to them and advocating for what you want. It's actually there as a service. Now, if we look at advocacy as a kind of the process that of thought that a group or an individual might go through when they're thinking about, okay, I want to advocate on this issue, they'll identify the issue or the problem. The research that needs to be done has been done, collating research, doing new research, identifying their calls to action, their visions, and establishing the key messages that they're going to push forward. Map out supporters and opposition, form coalitions, establish relationships, who you're going to have relationships with, who perhaps you're not going to have relationships with, and how perhaps you might engage the public. Identify the activities and approaches. Are you going to go inside? Are you going to go outside? Are you going to do something in the middle? Are you going to focus on awareness raising and media? Are you going to do political lobbying? Are you going to take on a watchdog role? Or are you going to do more service provider style work? You'll look at the opportunities for change, whether these are political change, whether there's an ally who's particularly interested in your issue that you can get on board, whether there's crisis, and these will constantly have to be evaluated because this is quite fast moving and changeable. And then finally, you'll monitor change and look at short-term wins that you can achieve and also long-term goals. So yeah, these are the kind of areas that you'll have to kind of think when you're planning advocacy. And I'm going to, in a minute, talk about 3 particular areas of this that have come out of my research and look at a kind of critical analysis, if you like, of both. So how it can work well in advocacy, but also looking at perhaps some of the ways it might be less effective in advocacy or some of the considerations you have to bear in mind, because I think it's important that you do critically evaluate what you're doing rather than just go, oh, this is great, this is what we're doing. But before I do that, I just wanted to kind of highlight some successes in food advocacy. These are listed in the briefing paper, and these have come up in my interviews as well, when I've asked people about, oh, name something that's been successful in advocacy. So restrictions on the marketing of unhealthy food to children. We have more sustainable fish sourcing and the logos on fish that you buy in supermarkets. Battery eggs, free range has become the kind of norm. The move towards mainstream fair trade products. There's been widespread salt reduction in processed foods. There's been front of pack labelling, increased across the board. We've got increased transparency in the food supply chain following the horse meat scandal, potentially, and reduction in the use of additives in food. So these are just some areas where there has been change. Now, we might not be where we want to be with these areas. We might be. But the idea is, or what I'm trying to say, is that 10 years ago we were in a different place and we have got somewhere. So this is potentially a success in food advocacy. But why are these areas, why has advocacy worked a little bit better on these issues, whereas some issues we haven't made as much traction with? And there'll be a wide range of reasons, the politics, as I've said, but also it could be around the actual methods of advocacy, the way we're advocating. So as I said, one of the issues that I wanted to kind of draw upon was this idea of messaging and advocacy. It's really important, and it came up, I think, in pretty much all of my interviews as a key component of advocacy in some form or another. There are different kind of types of messaging that you have to consider in advocacy. So your messaging around the general issues you stand for, whether it's a change in marketing practices, whether it's the need for more food education, but the general issue that you're looking at. You then have the framing of that debate. So where does the responsibility lie? Whose fault is it that we're where we are today? Is it individual responsibility? Is it government responsibility? Is it industry responsibility to make the changes? You then have the specific calls to action. So this is more around the actual policy that you are pushing for, or the changes that you're pushing for. And then the more subtle nuances around your messaging. And this is quite important. So for instance, the Children's Food Campaign at the moment is pushing for a sugar tax, but actually they've framed that as a sugar duty. So they've taken that decision to frame it differently in order to get more public support because people don't like the word tax. So issues like this are really quite important in advocacy because you want to get the support, and subtle changes can actually make a big difference because people, have different perceptions. Other considerations, messaging should always be evidence-based. Very quickly, if you come out with quite strong statements that are not evidence-based, they will be criticised. You need to consider the level of detail. How much detail do people actually need to know? There's what you know as an advocate, building up your evidence base, and then there's the detail that you actually present to people. Considerations around whether or not you focus on the solutions or the problems. So often it's very easy to identify all of the problems, but actually what are the solutions? And is the messaging that we can present around that? Is there a solution? Is it an easy solution? How are we going to get to that solution? And I think that's another area which, again, is coming through my interviews that perhaps needs to change slightly in how we're advocating. On a similar note, how adversarial or positive do you want to be in your messaging? Do you want to focus on what is being done or examples of good practice? Or do you want to only focus on what's bad and what isn't being done? Also, targeting messaging. Who are you actually targeting your message to? I think there's a wide range of actors out there. You might be wanting the public to get on board. You might be wanting governments to get on board. You might be wanting to get industry on board. And it's important to know that different messages will be appropriate for different groups, and you might need to adapt the simplicity or the nature of the messaging depending who you're targeting. And then also recognising that your cause may not always be what wins the change. And the reason I say this is this has come up in a couple of my interviews where ultimately you want to achieve a goal. That is what you want to do in advocacy, and you have your reasons for wanting to get there. But actually someone else might have slightly different messaging and a slightly different reason, but want to get to the same goal. Now, it might be that their messaging is going to get more traction with government and with businesses for change. And if that's the case, sometimes you do have to change your messaging slightly to actually adapt to what's going to make the change and be less precious, if you like, over what your personal views are. Because ultimately, if it gets you to your goal, it sort of doesn't matter how you get there. And I think one example, which I'll talk again about in a second, is with food labelling in this country when the government kind of agreed this voluntary front-of-pack nutrition labelling. Actually, what got to where we are now is actually not the health messaging as perhaps the health advocates would like. It was actually around getting consistency, and that was the message. So that then became the kind of what we were using in advocacy. It was about consistency, because that's what businesses bought into and that's what governments bought into. Sort of dropped the health side of it a little bit after we'd done the health advocacy in earlier days. So that's just a kind of an interesting note that's come out of a couple of my interviews. So then just on message framing, again, some quotes. It's about crafting a message that will work in a compelling way to the audience that you want to address. We've come together around some shared messaging, because the problem is if you have diversity and different messages, then policymakers go, whoa, can't deal with this. You're telling me this, you're telling me that. You know we're not getting a clear message, and companies can say the same thing too. So this is around consistency and looking, okay, what are our messages and what are other people's messages? And the other thing is differentiating between your principle and the details, i.e. no one is really interested in the details apart from the people who are already converted. So this is why I mentioned before that you need to consider about the level of detail that people actually need to know to get into, to get on board with your messaging, and what you can just kind of keep in the background. Then how messages are perceived. So these are interviews with non-advocates. This one's with next government person. So, well, the shouty organisations, they're just troublesome. You just have to listen and think, oh God, not them again. And it's easy to deal with if there's not evidence-based, because you just deploy rational arguments. But it's time-consuming and troublesome. So, of course, government and industry are likely to be challenging if you're being negative for their policies and you're being troublesome. Which some people might like to be. But I think I've highlighted here not evidence-based. I think this is, again, why it's really important that your messaging is evidence-based, because if you're not, it will be pulled apart. But if you do have that evidence-based and you can stand by that, it makes it much more difficult, however troublesome you might be being, for them to actually go against what you've said. There used to be a lot more rhetorical advocacy, as in a lot of complaining what was wrong. All they do is identify the problems, not the solutions. I think advocacy has changed and is more like that now. So this is coming back to what I said about the solutions versus the problems. And I think having that slightly positive focus on what we need to do is actually potentially going to be important. Sometimes what NGOs come up with can be quite, kind of a bit one-dimensional. So this is I think links into the idea that perhaps you do need to make sure that you have a wider understanding of the issues that you're dealing with, and you come from a very specific area, but actually there are a lot of other factors at play that you might need to consider in advocacy. So these are positive and negative message attributes. I've kind of discussed most of these, but the positive things that you need to do with messaging that is a bit more effective in advocacy is around making sure you have clear messaging, you have emotionally compelling messaging, it's phrased to get buy-in, it's consistent with your own messaging and other people's messaging, using numbers can be quite useful, presenting a business case, having an element of realism and presenting solutions. On the flip side, messaging that can perhaps be less useful or have a negative implication on your advocacy, being too specific or peripheral, having no call to action, not being based on evidence, being a bit too extreme or inconsistent, not differentiating between companies, only focusing on what's not being done, that not enough is being done rather than what has actually been achieved, being too simplistic and being too complicated. Hang on. So that was messaging. The public is another area of advocacy. As advocates, you're supposed to be representing a constituent group who will be the public in some form. And there are three kind of ways that you can really engage the public. You can inform and raise awareness about issues through awareness weeks. You can use the media. You can engage in campaigning and get them actually the ones who are delivering the messages to MPs, to industry, through various forms. I think Parent to Jury has done this quite well, and which campaigns do this as well. Or you can try and understand the concerns and needs of the public, looking at sort of focus group, community work, what is actually happening at a local level. And I think this last one is something which, again, from my interviews, is not actually being done enough in advocacy, but would actually have a lot of traction in terms of stimulating change. I'm going to skip the first two quotes. I guess one of them would be making sure that we are representing the views of the public, so what the public want, or at least what the public should want. They might not necessarily know it yet. And this is a really interesting quote, because on the one hand, they are saying we need to represent the public, we need to do what is good for the public, but at the same time saying, well, the public doesn't actually necessarily know they want it. It then becomes a bit questionable, are they representing the public? Why do the public not want it? Is simply raising awareness important, or actually are there other priorities that the public have that would be a better area to focus on? And then on a similar note, it's a complete reframing of the relationship, because at the moment they say they are reflecting consumer view, but mostly they're not. They're reflecting a public health view of what might be the right thing to do, but it's not necessarily what the public think right now. So again, this is an interesting quote with this dynamic between actually representing what is good for the public and actually representing the public themselves and their views and their priorities. So again, the kind of positive side, getting and demonstrating public support, understanding customers, giving the public an opportunity to have their voice heard, and creating pressure that government can't not act on, because remember, governments essentially get voted in by the public. But on the flip side, not actually representing the public, not having the support of the public, not speaking to those you claim to represent, and not understanding the new issues faced by those affected can kind of be detrimental to some of your arguments. And I know certainly in the area that I work in obesity, I do a lot of public health work, a lot of things about what I would say we need. Actually, I've never spoken to, the people who are up north with high levels of obesity about the challenges they're facing. And that's perhaps a flaw in the work that I personally do. So linked to working with the public is working with others. So you've got questions there about alliances and coalitions, networks of NGOs, grouping together to get these aligned messaging that I talked about, strengthening the work you can do, working inside and outside. You have partnerships, which can be more maybe with other sectors, other people, in order to try and stimulate change. And then there's this issue of speaking to the enemy, as it were, so whether NGOs work with industry or not. I'm going to skip them. So the focusing on the bottom two quotes, there's quite a skepticism sometimes about NGOs and advocates working with the food industry. So one of the people I interviewed said, don't sleep with the enemy, don't buy the hand that feeds you. And this is really highlighting the idea that you can lose some of the strength of your messaging if you work too closely with the enemy. However, a conference I've just come back from, George Elaine from PAHO said you need to speak to the devil, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to sleep with them. And I think this is a really interesting quote because it's recognising that actually we do need to speak to the government. We do need to speak to the food industry. We need to find out what their concerns are. We need to find out more about where they stand on the issue and why. But it doesn't necessarily mean we have to adopt their words, adopt their views. It just helps us to create a better argument and actually perhaps to have a response to their argument. So again, with coalitions and relationships, they help to have consistent messaging, consider commonalities between the groups, getting an adopter so others follow suit, co-create solutions, bring typical groups on board, produce a clear consensus statement. And then the negative sides are if you haven't got aligned messages, if policies are not aligned, there's a lack of consensus, you're not looking at the bigger picture, not taking the time to understand the wider issues or other priorities, ignoring the views of the opposition, and branding all the industry as one entity. I'm actually going to skip over this, but I will come back to it if people want to. So then finally, what I want to talk about is what do we mean by effective? So I said a few slides ago about, these are some areas of success. I've talked about, we can be a bit more effective in advocacy if we do X, Y, and Z. But what do I actually mean by effective? And this is one of the things I'm really looking at in my research, and it's actually a really difficult question. This is quite an interesting quote from someone I interviewed. I have always thought and continue to think that the job of organisations in our sector is to put ourselves out of business so that we are no longer needed. So the fact that a lot of organisations that we see today have been going for years and years and years might well mean that they're not actually being very effective in what they want to achieve. So what is effective? Is it about what advocates actually do, so their processes or their outputs? Publishing a briefing paper or holding a well-attended event? Is it about the publicity they achieve, so the outcomes, getting a lot of media coverage, getting a lot of people going to their websites? Is it about issue awareness? Is it the fact that public opinion on an issue shifts? Is it having lots of supporters? Is it raising awareness? Is it the fact that an issue has become part of a standard discourse? Or is it about the ultimate changes, so the impact, getting a favourable policy change, population health improving, or the shift in the status quo? Now, actually, all of these could be indicators of effectiveness, but I think what's important is that when you're looking at whether or not you've been effective, is that you do actually take into consideration the wide kind of range of measures that there are, and actually look at what you're measuring in relation to the context and know that there are actually other ways of measuring and other elements that you may or may not have ignored. And then similarly, when is a win a win? So food marketing restrictions, the Ofcom regulations on marketing are widely recognised as quite an effective policy change that was a result of advocacy. But there was no 9 p.m. watershed in those, which people are now campaigning on. So yes, there was some effectiveness, but it wasn't the complete picture. There's also a changing landscape relating to food marketing. We've got more social media and other ways of companies to market. The policy is now out of date. So is this a win? Was it a win and now it's no longer a win? Where does that kind of come in? School meal standards, they were introduced, but then in the last few years we've been redefending them. Again, where was the win? Are we now losing? Baby milk action and the campaign, the boycott of Nestle, for instance, widely recognised as an effective campaign. They got the code, there's been a lot of momentum. But they're still going 30 years later, and Nestle is still one of the most powerful companies in the world. Is that effective? I'm going to skip these. And then the question of whose win are we talking about? So with the school meals, was that Caroline Walker Trust and all the work that was done to establish targets and guidelines? Or was that Jamie Oliver? Salt reduction, Was it CASH, Consensus Action on Salt and Health, and all the advocacy work that they did? Or was it the Food Standards Agency? Because although a lot of people recognise CASH as being really important, actually when salt left the Food Standards Agency was when it was derailed. CASH is still there, the Food Standards Agency isn't. So there's a question there of, how much credit can one organisation take? I used to work at CASH, by the way, so I'm I'm not slating them. And then food labelling, again, was that actually NGO advocacy that got us to where we are today with the voluntary traffic light labelling? Was it a result of the EU law changing, or was it Tesco's decision? What actually caused the change? So sorry, I've sped up because Tim's looking at me. So we can discuss some of these again in a sec. So yeah, there's a lot of issues around, what is effective in advocacy, how do we measure it, and therefore how do we evaluate it and move forward and learn from it. So advocacy is complicated, it's fluid, it's dynamic, it's a mixture of judgment and evidence, it's a result of the policy and the issue context that it's in. It faces a number of challenges and pushbacks. We need to constantly evaluate and reevaluate what we're doing, and it's not enough just to say we're doing it because it's what we do. It's not enough to say, we need to think about the messaging and not actually think about all the different factors within that. And we also need to better understand effectiveness, acknowledge the challenges, and look to kind of come up together with what we think is effective and how we can use that to improve what we're doing and to improve food systems and improve health. So we need more academic analysis, I think, of policy theory and actually the role that advocacy plays in that, and more academic analysis of the strategy of advocacy. We need more recognition of important progress stages. So if you're looking at where you started from and your ultimate goal, what are the key things that you want to target along the way that would perhaps not be ultimately your goal, but represent that you've made progress? And we need better indicators and recognition of effectiveness. Internally, this can help us become better advocates because it gives us a framework in which to evaluate what we're doing. But externally, actually, it could have the benefit of helping us to get more funding into civil society, into NGOs, because we have a better way of saying, look, this is actually what we achieve. This is what we can do to make a difference. So yeah, that's my kind of presentation on advocacy, and yeah, I look forward to discussing some of the issues with you all.
Indeed. I mean, Hannah, to kick off the questions, even though I know your work, and I know what you're trying to do, for me, one of the most interesting things in the presentation you gave was about, are you arguing that the public health advocates of the last 20, 30 years have tended to measure their success and what is effective advocacy by their noisiness, if you know what I mean, media coverage, public support in opinion polls. And actually what you were saying is really when push comes to shove, it's events changing that they need to be measured. And there you were giving a very a sting in the tail of that analysis, because you were giving examples, those ones that you flicked over, of where a success had happened, but it was basically marginalized by further events. So I have two questions. One, did I read you right? Are you saying actually there needs to be a bit of hardness about measuring success? And secondly, was I reading you right that you were actually saying that success isn't an instant thing, it's something that's long term? And maybe that's your answer to your own question about, say, baby milk action. Nestle's still around, the code is being flouted, but would it be worse if they weren't there?
Yeah. Okay, so the first question, which was around where people are measuring themselves at the moment, I think that's what I found, is that a lot of people are measuring their advocacy based on the media coverage that they get. And I think that while that is important, it's just one element of it, and the fact that you get media coverage doesn't necessarily result in the change that you're wanting. I think it's important that you do measure yourself against your goals. One of the people that I interviewed from the food industry actually commented in the interview about how they'd seen that a campaign had been evaluating themselves based on all of this media coverage. Actually, the media coverage was in The Guardian, and they were like, well, the people that shop at our supermarket don't really read The Guardian. So for them, that wasn't actually success in terms of trying to influence consumers, because they were like, well, it's not going to the right people. So I think that there are a lot more dynamics that need to be considered in advocacy. Second question, long term. Yes, this is all very long-term work, which I think makes it very difficult to evaluate, because people are not necessarily even in the job, they're doing jobs for a few years and then they move on. And I think that certainly it is long-term change. And I think you're right in saying that we do need to sometimes look back at what could have happened or what we think might have happened had we not been there. And I think that's an important reflection. Obviously, we can never know what would have happened had baby milk actually not been there. Where would we be? But I think actually looking back 20 years and saying, okay, well, this is the issue. And I saw some interesting marketing the other day about it was about sugar, and it was basically saying that children needed sugar for energy. And it was this picture, and that was the kind of marketing that was going on. And it does actually make you think, well, actually, there might be a lot of problems with the marketing today, but it has certainly changed. Now it might be more sort of psychologically based, and it's less, you don't know you're being advertised to, but it's shifted. There's been a shift, and I think we do need to reflect back as well as kind of looking forward.
So gradations of impact. Okay, questions? You see, the rule is you say who you are.
Georgine Leung.
Which one?
Okay. I'm Georgine Leung, a public health nutritionist. Thanks very much for the summary, Hannah. I just would like to know if you could elaborate, perhaps in your current role, are there main challenges that you face as head of advocacy, and also how do you, say, evaluate your work to ensure that effective monitoring is in place, please?
Interesting question. Challenges from an advocacy perspective where I work are probably the biggest one, other than if we ignore food industry lobbying, which is a big issue, but it's actually the fact that we work internationally, and that's a really big challenge, because it's very difficult to work out where you need to place your advocacy and your emphasis. Do we need to target WHO and the UN institutions? Do we need to be targeting national governments? And actually, you need to be targeting both, but then that's hard work. But advocacy is hard work. But as I said, industry lobbying is really difficult, and in particular, it's not so bad actually in the UK, but in some countries, their governments are very entwined with food companies, which makes it very difficult then to get them on side, and they'll block agendas. And so that's a really challenging area as well that we have to overcome, and we just have to keep pushing and getting small wins. So at the moment, one of the pieces of work we're doing is we're trying to push for some form of food treaty that pulls together all the different policies related to obesity and healthy diets. And we started at WHO level, then we went to national level. And we're actually getting a lot of momentum in South America at the moment. So we're really pushing those kind of buttons where there is support, trying to get them to talk about it, and then we'll take it back to the WHO. So it's kind of flitting between the two.
Just give a bit more, do people know about this? Is the idea of a global framework convention?
So, okay, so tobacco has something called the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, which basically, as I say, pulls together all the different policies. It has articles on pricing, on marketing, on what else? Diversification. Yeah, all of these areas, and basically, countries all around the world have signed up to this treaty, and the idea is they're meant to be meeting all of the restrictions. And there's been a lot of evidence that it's been quite effective in making sure that policies happen, that tobacco control is introduced in countries. We have replicated some of those chapters. We've reframed them to be about food, so food marketing, food labelling, food guidelines. Don't think we have anything on agriculture. I think that was
Something
one of
on
the
ingredients.
And the idea is that we're pushing for this to be developed and ratified at a WHO level in order to make countries more likely, or make countries actually take action on the different areas, because at the moment it's all a bit sporadic. You know, here we have quite good salt policy, we have a bit of labelling, we have some marketing restrictions, but we don't have the full package. And I think with things like obesity and things like diet, you need the full package in order to actually make improvements. Otherwise you just kind of navigate, well, the industry can navigate around the policies. And also from a global perspective, it would be good to have something like the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, because it helps protect small countries who perhaps don't really have any power behind them to actually stand up to companies who are lobbying in their country, who are investing in their countries. So having this kind of big policy that countries all around the world have adopted gives them more power to say no and to implement and protect the health of their children.
Very good. There's lots. Hannah knows a lot about. There's someone over here. Can you see me?
Hi, I'm Matt Jones. I'm a public health academic at the University of the West of England. Environmental sustainability NGOs have had something of a debate about the role of values in how they do their advocacy messaging. So, for example, they could go to lower order values of "this will save you money" kind of strategies versus higher order values of "this is socially just, it may not be good for you, but it's the right thing to do." In your research, have you encountered that kind of debate around the role of how to work values into advocacy?
Interestingly, no, not particularly. There hasn't been much, and actually thinking about it, it probably would be an area that would be of quite a lot of interest, but no, that's not something that's particularly come out in anything I've been doing.
There's some useful literature which
Okay.
might be quite good.
Can you pass it through to the guy at the right of black?
Hi, my name. Is it on?
It's just recording.
Cool. My name's Leo, and I'm a PhD candidate at SOAS in the anthropology department. And I just want to ask you maybe a slightly semantic question. What's the difference between an advocate, a campaigner, and an activist?
I took a slide out about that.
That's something I'm trying to label with some of the people when I'm studying. I'm trying to wonder how I should label them.
I think it's very difficult. That's one of the things that's come out of my research. There's actually, kind of like I was saying about the inside-outside spectrum, there's actually a kind of scale of where people sit. So some people would classify advocates as kind of general group of people, and then activists are more the outside people, and maybe lobbyists are more inside. I don't know what the did you say lobbyists, or did you say?
I said an advocate, a campaigner, and an activist, because I'm.
Okay. And then campaigners, I don't know. I can't answer that. Do you have any answer from social movements? No.
My question was exactly
The same.
Okay, let's give it to Sergio then. No, this is a good question.
Yeah, my question exactly was to elaborate a little bit more on that, because, well, this is, at the end, advocacy is a kind of mediation exercise between one body, that is the state, the public, and the other body, that is the societies. Is also public, but it's a different kind of public body. But at the end, there are different ways to do it. Advocacy is one of them. Well, the private sector also make consultancy. There are also different kind of mediations. So my experience, for instance, I start with social movements when we go out from the dictatorship in Brazil, and then the Catholic Church always had this kind of advisors, you know. At that time, the name for what is modern, this contemporary advocacy at that time was called the advisor. So we always look for the advisor to say some very nice words, some very bright, you know, to save for the movements. Well, better to go this way, better to go that way. So I have a lot of respect of this kind of people. But from my experience, sometimes advocators, so who makes advocacy, sometimes miss the point exactly when the advocator should stay in behind or should stay in front of the issue, in front of, for instance, the social movement, or than the point of academic or research evidence. So what I would like to ask you is about this teeny point, really slight point, when you as advocates, and how do you know about when it's time to go more backwards or to give room for evidence? So in your exercise, in your work, how you measure this and how this works in your everyday work?
Sergio, you're from the other side of the world, but you have to
Sorry. Sorry, I'm a sociologist from Brazil. Based here at academic visitor. Thank you.
His name is Sergio Schneider from Brazil. Another question.
I think that's an interesting question, and again, it's an area which I've kind of been questioning quite a lot, as in, when do you take that step back? And I think that people don't know, and I think it's an area that people should take more notice of, because I think that if you don't do it correctly, that's when you get the pushback from the industry. I think that this kind of links more to the question around activism. I think there's an element where sometimes you have an issue on an agenda, and if it's on the agenda already, I think it's more about getting the public behind you and focusing on that element of what we're talking about. I think before that, I think is when you need more of the evidence base, and you're pushing that, and then I think you can change it. What is challenging to do is to make, as you say, to make that decision, and I don't necessarily think that I or anybody else quite has that answer, but I do think that raising it as an issue is really important, and that people who are doing it are aware that they need to be careful of crossing that line. It doesn't really answer your question, but sort of.
Hi, I'm Kelly Parsons. I'm a PhD student at the Centre for Food Policy here at City. Hi, Hannah. I wanted to ask you to say a bit more about what you've heard from the NGOs you've spoken to about two things. One was about the role of inside track advocacy now, because a lot of the sort of wins that you talked about were kind of looked like they were industry based. And not particularly about government interventions. And the other thing was about what the NGO view is of the role of academia and academic work, how useful they find it, because obviously we're always suffering from a bit of a time lag in academia in terms of, and some of the NGOs I've spoken to have, have been a bit sort of dismissive of the idea of studying it, because they're always one step ahead and they're just going out there and doing it. So just if you could talk a bit about what you've found in terms of those things.
Yeah, that's really a really interesting question. I'll start with the second one around academia. I think that certainly the NGOs all kind of referred to the need for evidence, which obviously usually, well, one type of evidence does come from academia. I think one of the problems, and this is a problem that I find myself as well, is that in academia, and perhaps maybe not in the people who are in this room from academia, but there's a tendency to do research and then not actually consider what the policy implications are. And I think that's where there's a gap. And that's something that's coming out of my research. So there's an issue in the whole evidence-based policy debates. I mean, what evidence is right? And I think there's potentially a role for academics to, or I think there should be more of an encouragement on academics to actually look at, when they do any form of research, to go, okay, well, what does this actually mean for our policy agenda? And also, I don't know if it comes from academia or if it needs to come from somewhere else, but kind of reframing what is good evidence from an academic sense, because there's still this big idea that we can get all the answers that we need from randomized controlled trials, which is just not correct and just not reflective. So I don't know if that's something that academics need to push and to say, we are coming from academia, we're very important people as they are perceived, what we can offer this. So I think that that's an interesting area, because certainly the idea that the research that sometimes comes out to evaluate the problems that we're discussing from an advocate's point of view is not really aligned. And the first question was... Inside track, how relevant is it? Oh yeah, so that's another interesting one. And
so inside track.
So looking at inside track and outside track, and whether how sort of NGOs perceive the different ones. I think it was very dependent on the organisation that I spoke to. So some organisations were fully kind of behind that approach. They said, you know, working with governments, it's the best thing to do. Almost sounded a bit like they had potentially resided to the fact that the policy system is as it is and we have to go with it. And that if we, you know, keep pushing, there will be decisions made there. But campaigners basically said that consultations are a waste of time, that it's a way of sort of buying the NGO sector, keeping them quiet. I know one or two people actually spoke about how they had been invited to a round table and then made the decision to actually leave that because they weren't getting what they wanted, and that was a kind of decision they made, and it was almost an advocacy statement that they could then use as their own kind of media campaign around it. So I think it really just depends on where the organisation sits and how far from the status quo, if you like, that they're willing to push it, how valuable they see it.
But did you get an impression that there's been a trend away from inside track towards outside from the people that you spoke to, in terms of the connections available, the kind of individuals available within government to actually work with?
In terms of, if we talk about inside track as in inside government, yes. I think some people would say that we don't want, you know, the government is still who needs to make the policy, but they're not, therefore we need to go to industry. Often, if you can get to the right people, it's often quicker to make the changes, and you can obviously often make bigger changes. So if you're dividing inside and outside like that, if actually I've kind of pulled that side of things into inside, because I think it's still going to the elite people who are making decisions as opposed to campaigning on the outside. I don't necessarily think there's been a shift there, I think, but within inside, I think there's been a shift away from government and towards industry.
Hannah, doesn't that go back to Matt Jones's question about values? That shift that Kelly Parsons' question got you to answer, that there is itself a reflection of people's political, with a big P, political analysis that the current government is not interested in responding to advocacy. It's got a hardline or relatively hardline policy agenda, and you're not going to influence it. So actually, the inside track is less useful now. It's the outside track that matters. Isn't that a values question?
Yes.
We've got two.
Yeah, Sian Thomas from the Food Standards Agency. So, first of all, we do still exist.
Okay, yeah, you do. This is true.
Responsibility for nutrition in England, but we still do in Northern Ireland. So it's very complicated, and I think that makes your job much harder. We're seeing a lot more advocacy from within government, and I'd be interested on your views on that. Also interested, I work on food safety much more than I do on nutrition, although I work right across the agency. Really interested to hear which good bits of the nutrition work we can take and apply in food safety and how we might do that. And then a final point, we put all our information into the public domain. So if people are working in the advocacy space and they want to come and talk to the Food Standards Agency about information, particularly about people's interest in relation to food, we can point you to some really high quality evidence. It doesn't get used enough, and we'd like to work with academics much more to make sure that our evidence is used, even if it's not for the purpose that we originally commissioned it. So I guess that's an open offer to all of you. Do come and speak to me, particularly if you want to know what our evidence is and where it is, because we can direct you to the evidence that already exists.
And what, I mean, without putting you on the spot, he says immediately putting you on the spot. Do you think my reading is wrong? Is that there's less room for manoeuvre? I mean, you probably can't answer this because it's delicate for you, but the Food Standards Agency is now 2 floors of a building. It used to be 5. There's no one there. There's no one there for us to advocate to. It's inconceivable, I think, Hannah, maybe I shouldn't have put you on the spot.
No, that's fine.
It's inconceivable for the Food Standards Agency to do the SALT campaign that it did in 2001-2. It's inconceivable. The government just wouldn't accept it, and there's not enough there to do it, even if it did.
The approaches that are available to us are very different from what was there at the start.
That's a prize for diplomacy.
But the desire to do things that are impactful is not. And we only have 2 floors in London now because of the government's policy to devolve. I work from home 2 days a week, so I don't have a desk in London, but I'm based in the London office. So I think the better use of space and the consideration for taxpayers' money is why we don't have the whole building. But there are still the people. Just it's the point about people moving and the context in which government is doing business changing that is important. And I think that we have a bigger desire to work with, in partnership with academics and other collaborators, to make things happen that are for the public good and in the advocacy space, because we have less and less money. We have to keep doing more and more with less, and we have to look at alternatives, and that is having a big impact on the way we work.
Very good. That was not just a diplomatic answer, but a very good answer. And passing it over, I'll give an example. At a previous time when government was very anti-government, taking a lead on public health, and I was in Hannah's position then, this is 30 years ago, working in NGO, and the senior civil servant came to me and said, I'm prepared to fund you to cause trouble to another department. So strange things happen when the state is shrinking. And it worked. It got us cooking today.
Hi, I'm Marion, and I'm Marion Conn. I'm doing the MSc here at Food Policy. I just wanted to build on your point, actually, because I was interested in the funding side of things. Did anything come out of your research in terms of there's just not a lot of money there, and there seems to be a small pot that's having to be cut many more times? A few individual trusts and foundations that fund so much food stuff. But any insights there about what's going on with the funding side for you and for NGOs, I mean? There wasn't any insight per se, except to say that there isn't enough money. And actually the money conversation mostly focused around when I was asking about, how do you evaluate your work? How do you assess work? People were saying there's just no money available to do that. We have no time to do that. If we spend this amount of time evaluating what we do, well, we're wasting time pushing agendas. So that did come up as a big issue. But there was no particular reflection on, if that's going to change. I think people just felt generally it's squeezed, but I think it's across the board. So it's challenging, and I think you do have to pay for the experts in the field, and so then you get a challenge. It's like there are a lot of people who are willing to volunteer and things, but it's challenging to get that balance between experts and interest and pulling it together. Just going back to your question, actually, on intergovernment advocacy, can you actually reflect a bit on, do you mean different departments to each other? So, or do you mean that, can you just reflect slightly on what you meant?
Yeah, so between departments, but also we all eat. So just because I work at the Food Standards Agency doesn't mean that I can have my own views on what good food might look like and how to make sure that other people have access to the information that I use in making my choices. So I take personal responsibility for that, and I encourage my colleagues in the agency to do the same. We're all very encouraged by our senior managers at the moment to do that. And if we could work with people outside of the Food Standards Agency to extend those messages, which aren't unaligned with what you're trying to achieve anyway, then we'd be really happy to do that with our people and their voice, which kind of gets to a different audience, so it's in everybody's interests.
You're giving us sort of a holy as well as unholy alliances.
There isn't going to be an answer to everything, but there are going to be bits of things where the divide between inside and outside is really not that clear, and I think food is really special in that space. Some of the things, perhaps tobacco and things, where it's not so possible, but food it might be.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, generally in the work that I do, in terms of campaigning for change and the policies, I sort of stay away from the awareness raising side of things because I think there are bigger issues that need to be tackled. But I do think at the same time there is a role for doing work in that area. I think at the end of the day, people do make some choices, and they might be limited in what choices they can make, and there might be changes that need to be made to help that be a healthier choice. But there are, at the end of the day, people are still making decisions. And I think if there are models of that kind of, colleague to colleague sort of advocating, I think that is actually something that could be used more, because often what we see with awareness campaigns is it's, me as public health nutritionist telling a group of people who I have nothing in common with, who, we've come from different backgrounds, we have different interests, and it doesn't really work, that kind of having the, someone up here telling someone. And so I think that, or the perception of that anyway, I think that there is, something in that kind of colleague to colleague. And I think it's kind of what, I don't know how well it was, but I know Jamie Oliver tried to do that with his cooking in the, in that town somewhere. Yeah. Where he was trying to get people to teach, their friends and family how to cook, rather than someone else just coming in and telling them. So I think there is something in that.
That's funny enough. That's where the Food Standards Agency, the work was set up, still being done on public attitudes, is extremely useful data source for campaigns. Actually, exactly your point.
Hi. Yeah, sure. Sarah Kehoe, public health nutritionist from the University of Southampton. I think we're almost touching on the question actually that I had, which was how important is it to have a champion that people look up to, who isn't necessarily from the scientific background, as an advocate, or to be part of an advocacy campaign?
Well, this came up a couple of times in my interviews. So on the one hand, I think it's very easy to argue that it's positive. Like Jamie Oliver has had a really big impact. I think Hugh Fanning-Whistle has as well on the fish campaign that he's doing. So I think there are a lot of areas where it's positive. But I do think it needs to be something that's done with caution, and it needs to be done well, because I think that if you have someone advocating an issue, the messages they come out with can be incorrect sometimes, and like I was saying, the messages should be evidence-based. Now, Jamie Oliver is he's very passionate about it for a start, but also there was the Caroline Walker Trust. A lot of work had been done before that kind of gave a grounding to what he was doing, which I think helped it to be positive. But I think there is also a risk in relying on that, and also in finding people yourself. So if you're working in an organisation, trying to hunt down someone who can, you think will champion, is not going to be the same as someone personally deciding that they want to get involved with it and coming into it that way. So I think that it is very beneficial, and I think, with Jamie, we can see it with the sugar stuff as well. He's been really good for a lot of public health nutrition, but I don't necessarily think that it's a definite tick all of the time. And I think we can see that with hospital food, for instance. I think every chef has tried to support hospital foods, and it's not really getting anywhere. So, yeah.
Not every chef is supporting Jamie Oliver on sugar. We've got a queue.
Thanks. I'll be speedy. My name's Kira Box. I'm a food campaigner at Friends of the Earth. And just to vaguely touch on a couple of things that went by, we very much have an approach that everyone is an advocate. One end of advocacy is you're kind of lobbying, then you kind of move through lots of types of campaigning, and once you're an activist, you tend to be much more on the ground. And we're trying to support local activists to make change in their cities and work with restaurants and businesses at a local level. So
that's your answer to the SOAS.
Yeah, that was back on that one.
Were you listening?
I thought I'd just do every question one by one. But then back on the kind of different strategies things.
Yeah.
So very first question. We've really been having that problem. And on another question, I should say we've entirely gone for activists because of the government political angle, because that is where we think that we can work with people and make concrete change and hopefully demonstrate that some people are interested in changing their diet for health reasons and for environmental reasons, and because good food tastes better. So we're trying to give people the tools to do that locally, and we're having a real issue on this. How do we work with business, and what are the best levers? Do we keep plugging the environment angle and hope that people take it on board? Do we combine it with health? Do we combine it with you'll make more money? Do we combine it with you'll just look really nice for consumers? So I know that you were kind of saying on the inside angle you didn't have a lot on policymakers and maybe what the levers were there, or rather on NGOs and how they were approaching those levers. But in terms of retailers, businesses, kind of distributors, did you get any sense from them on what was making a difference from them? What was making them reformulate their food or take steps, Wonky Veg, for example, to do things, apart from Hugh Fearnley-Whitton still?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I think it comes down to money a lot of the time, and I don't necessarily think they shied away from saying that in so many words. I think if you can frame it correctly, or not necessarily money even, but numbers, I think work quite well. I think there was some examples given of one organisation was proposing that they would make certain changes, and a campaigning group said, well, why don't if you'll have this benefit doing that, but if you do it this way, you'll have this increased benefit. And they were like, okay, fine. So that kind of number approach worked really well. I think that it's interesting you're talking about environment, because in a lot of my interviews, the reflections were if health was more like environment. And we've got it sorted with environment. If health could, yeah, quite. And they were it was very interesting, because a couple of the industries people I spoke to were very keen to speak about their environment work and saying, oh, you know, we've done all of this great work together, and we've got so far, and health needs to be the same. Apparently in environment, there's a much more systems change approach, which is apparently very good for industry. So I think, I don't really know how that answers your question, but it's an interesting reflection, as you obviously are looking at it from a different way. But one of the people I did speak to from my retailer did specifically say they thought that environment and health should talk to each other and incorporate their messaging to try and push the agenda, but we kind of do that and they don't.
Can I push that question further? Yeah. Because one of the things, listening to your talk, I was thinking you've presented the talk, understandably, focused on the perspective of the campaigner, of the advocate, of the activist, whichever they are. Flip-sided, did you find any people in industry that you interviewed wanting to have advocacy? In other words, a bit like my civil servant 30 years ago saying, I need the policy space to be able to get the change, and I can't do it on the inside track. We need the outside people to create the space. Did you find anyone in industry pushing for that?
The people that I heard that from, or the perspective that I heard that from, was where in, say for instance, in salt reformulation, there's been a lot of work done by manufacturers and retailers, the big ones, but the small ones haven't. And they were saying what they need advocates to be continuing to do what they're doing, but to actually take a bigger picture and look at what isn't being done by the smaller companies, looking at the catering industry. So they, in that sense, they are saying, yes, we do need the advocates, but don't shout at us. But you know, they do need them to actually get this whole level playing field, which is ultimately what will sell to food industry, to manufacturing. I think is why salt was able to work as it did, or one of the reasons was this level playing field between companies, because I think one of the people I spoke to actually described it, but it's such a raw area, like with the retailers. You can walk into one retailer one day, and if they've done something that you don't agree with, you can go into another one pretty easily. So I think that the level playing field is really important. So anything you do to highlight that is important, but I think that's the extent that it went.
Hi, I'm Katie Hudson. I'm a part-time master's student on the food policy course here at City. I'm really interested in this question of who the advocates are actually representing, whether they're really representing what people want or what people should want.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether you'd looked at all at how or why people become advocates in the first place, because I think that probably affects the messages that they take forward.
Yeah, so I don't really have a very good answer to that, because this is actually something that I hadn't considered at all in any of my sort of preliminary work, and it only came out in interviews, so it's only something that I'm finding out now, of going, oh, that's actually a really good point that I had never really considered, to be honest, that you are supposed to be representing people, and what do you do if the public isn't aware of an issue and you're campaigning on it because it's better for the public, is that bad, or do you know what I mean? It's,
do you know about the concept of rational ignorance?
Well,
yeah, so it's kind of...
Hold on, sorry, I shouldn't have walked away. I was the other side of the room.
No, it wasn't really a question, it was just an addition, like the concept of rational ignorance and people deciding that they aren't going to have an opinion because they can't have an opinion about everything.
Yeah.
So
but it's an interesting area, and hopefully, I don't know how I'm going to, but hopefully it's something that I can explore a bit when I go back to the literature. Tim, I'm going to have to go.
Yeah, you're going to have to go. You've got one more question.
Okay, I've got 1 more minute, one more question.
Firstly, can I just say, I'm Caroline Seaman, I'm from Norfolk. I've just come from Food Matters, where I've just been watching all sorts of exciting industry formulations that have been presented for, that's the first. And I was really interested to hear what you were talking about with the evidence base, and that you have to quote the evidence base. But from my experience as a specialist food practitioner, having become an advocate for the seldom heard, because I was very aware that frequently they were not being represented in many of the representative groups. They weren't represented in most of the Food Standards Agency stuff. If you looked at the demographics of who had responded to those things, a lot of young people that I was working with, their voices weren't being captured. But if there is no evidence base, but you have all the practical, on the ground, hardcore experience and evidence that you then take to your superiors, for want of a better word, just because there is no evidence, I was taught when I joined public health, it doesn't mean to say that there isn't evidence, it just means that it hasn't been done. But a lot of the research that needs to be brought out in order to be done is not the kind of research that can be done in those communities that qualifies for a randomized control trial, because you immediately set up a barrier within those communities. So from my perspective, I find that I end up with we don't have anything to go with, but we know that it's absolutely right.
Yeah. So I think I agree. I think that when I'm talking about evidence, I think I'm coming at it more from make sure that what you're saying is truthful, and don't over-exaggerate issues, and go back to what can actually be proved. So it might be that you're talking about something which isn't academic evidence, but some other form of evidence. That's still evidence and still something that can be used. And perhaps I should have sort of said that a bit more, but it's when I was talking about the importance of having the evidence base, is more about not having flaws in your argument, because I think as long as you can stand by what you're saying, it can't be, or it's less likely to be criticised and critiqued. And I think this comes kind of back to what I was saying before to Kelly's question about the role of academia. So I think there is something that academia can do to try and help us to reframe what evidence is in public health and for this purpose, because at the moment what is considered good evidence is not particularly useful for the kind of on-the-ground advocacy change work that we're doing.